Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
History, especially America's godly heritage. In this hour, that's exactly what we're going to do. Focus on what you might refer to as the Black Robed Regiment. You might say, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, this was a term that was actually coined by a British loyalist by the name of Peter Oliver, and it was an attempt to say that the pastors and preachers of the 18th century who wore black robes, in some respects, were very responsible for the American Revolution. And this is the term that the British referred to them as the Black Robe Regiment. The preaching and the teaching in the pulpits in the 18th century led in part to the American Revolution. And so we're going to spend some time today focusing on that. Let me just initially say that we're going to be using a lot of great material from a book by Dan Fisher called Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment, a call for preachers who will fight. And this is a resource that we have posted on our website. So if you'd like to get the book, it's about 400 pages. We're not going to cover all of it, not even close. That is available. There's also a DVD that goes with it as well. But we've also, in addition to that, given you an opportunity to see some of the slides that I've used in a presentation based upon this book and some of the other study that I've done as well. And that PDF is available at pointofview.net. So you can go there right now if you'd like and follow along as I'm teaching. Occasionally I'll refer to something in one of the diagrams, and it certainly is easier to follow if you happen to be following it. Or if you'd like to look at it later, it's available to you. But again, this is material put together by Dan Fisher. He's a pastor, former member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. And again, it's all about these patriot preachers, individuals who actually were very instrumental, as we're going to see over this next hour, in terms of really motivating individuals to consider liberty and to look at the possibility that they might separate from England and really declare their independence. And so, again, this is a resource that I think will be very helpful to you. And at the outset, let me mention, I'm going to only focus on a few of the key figures, and I'm not even suggesting that all the pastors and preachers actually supported the revolution. I mean, you have probably the most outstanding Tory who disagreed with that would be John Wesley. He was, of course, British, but nevertheless, there were some pastors and preachers who did not support the American Revolution, but we're going to look on those that did. Now, in terms of some of the biblical passages, a couple that I've put on the screen, one comes from Proverbs 14, verse 34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And, of course, that goes along with, of course, Psalm 33:12, which talks about the fact that, indeed, this is a nation whose God is the Lord. So we certainly recognize how important righteousness is. Psalm 91:7, and that is, the wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. And so one of the emphasis, I think, that, and really the application point is that we certainly, as believers, support the fact that we believe in religious liberty, something we talk about so often here on Point of View, and we should certainly be people of indeed we want God's blessing on this country. Let me specific stories of some of these individuals, give you a little bit of the history. And this is part of the history that has been lost. I dare say that your children or grandchildren, if they've been in the public schools in the last couple of years, have not heard a word about this. I would would suggest to you that maybe even if you're much older, you probably haven't heard much about this, because unless you went maybe to a Christian school where the teacher was really interested in this, almost everything you're going to hear over this hour is probably new. That wasn't always the case. If you go back to the 19th century, there were a number of that talk about this, and one of those is Frank Moore. Wrote a book in 1862, right during the Civil War, interestingly enough, The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution. And he said that the preachers of the Revolution great political and social evils of their day. Now, that was true in the First Great Awakening, it was true during the American Revolution, and it was certainly true during the Second Great Awakening as well. And we've talked about some of that here on Point of View. Another book that came out also during that same period of time came out in 1860, The Pulpit of the American Revolution by John Wingate Thornton. And he says, the fathers of the Republic invoked God in upon their chosen teachers of religion to counsel from the Bible and recognized its precepts as the law of their public conduct. The fathers did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly, which I think is so interesting, because this idea today that we should separate politics and religion, we're told not to talk about politics and religion in mixed society, and certainly we should never talk about politics in church. That was not the idea of those who were the center of the intellectual life. All the churches really were kind of the center of the intellectual life and the center of culture at that time, and they certainly did not want to divorce politics and religion. John Wingate Thornton goes on to say they prepared for the struggle and went into the battle, not as soldiers of fortune, but with the word of God in their hearts and trusting in him. That was the secret of their moral energy, which sustained the republics in its material weakness against superior numbers and discipline and all the power of England. England sent her armies to compel submission, and the colonists appealed to heaven. So we're going to spend some time in a number of key figures. Probably one that we've mentioned a little bit on this program before is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. And I'll also even talk a little bit about the correspondence between Peter Muhlenberg and his brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who later changed his mind. Then we're going to talk about people like Jonas Clark and what happened in Lexington and Concord. We'll talk about James Caldwell, who was actually a Presbyterian in New Jersey. And then we'll get into just a few of the other key figures that were very instrumental in the founding of this country and the framing of the Constitution, and even of the waiting from a biblical point of view, things like civil disobedience. Jonathan Mayhew, very famous essay and sermon on the idea of non-resistance and civil disobedience and how that came to be. And John Witherspoon, who was an individual that was the president of what today is Princeton University, many members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and others. And before we're through, since, again, the title of this book is Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment, what about the responsibility that pastors and even we church members have in terms of articulating a biblical worldview? But we need to take a break, and let me just mention again, if you're just joining us, that we're working our way through the book by Dan Fisher called Bringing Back. There's also a DVD that goes with it. And if you'd like to follow along, we've posted my PDF on your smartphone and see some of the diagrams, some of the pictures that I'll be referring to. And it's all available to you at our website, pointofview.net. And I hope that at the end you say, I might like to listen to that again. You have an opportunity to either watch it or, more importantly, just simply listen to it as a podcast, and even send it on to some others that you think might want to hear that as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about some of those patriot preachers in the 18th century. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It is hard to imagine how a coffee house in Laurel, Maryland would be controversial. After all, the Ragamuffins Coffee House is known for not only serving coffee, but also for serving up a special blend of community service and worship. Apparently, it is that last item that started all the controversy. The local church opened the doors to the coffee house and opened its arms to reach out to the homeless and needy families in the community. But a new city ordinance banned them from holding any services in the building. Apparently, offering coffee 6 days a week was fine, but offering an extra shot of God on Sunday was not. Christiana Holcomb, legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, joined me on the Point of View radio talk show to explain why they had to seek legal action. The city adopted new zoning codes with the express intention of stopping the church from operating in the city's downtown area. First, it banned nonprofit organizations, but then changed the law to make houses of worship restricted to second-class zoning. The current law forces churches and other Christian organizations to submit to an expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain special exemption. This is a process not imposed on other secular organizations. What happened to this church and its coffee house is hardly an exception. Churches, home Bible studies, and Christian schools have had local governments use zoning laws to restrict their activities and even shut them down. Fortunately, there are some encouraging signs. Various religious liberty groups such as ADF, First Liberty Institute, and the American Center for Law and Justice are taking these cases, and the Justice Department has announced a place of worship initiative that would enforce religious protections. This is good news for churches and Christian outreaches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Topic today is the idea of the Black Robed Regiment, which again refers to those 18th century pastors and preachers who were so instrumental in beginning to educate and encouraging individuals in the American colonies to actually participate in the American Revolution. One of the key figures is a man by the name of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. We'll just refer to him as Peter Muhlenberg. He was a Lutheran pastor, but in addition to being the pastor, also served in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, Virginia. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, Virginia, you actually go into the House of Burgesses, and he served in there with people like George Washington and a number of other individuals as well. Patrick Henry, probably one of the more fiery individuals who earlier that year had actually called for them to stand up and either said, "Give me liberty or give me death," and even had this idea of plunging a knife into his heart, and it caught everybody's attention. Well, eventually it began to be obvious to him that he was going to have to serve and wanted to serve in the military. And so he left from Williamsburg, which is sort of in the southeastern corner of Virginia, back to his pulpit, which is in Woodstock, Virginia, which is kind of in the northwest corner, and had announced that on January 21st, 1776, he was going to preach his last sermon. And he chose to preach on the book of Ecclesiastes, and in particular, Ecclesiastes 3. And especially there was a very significant time in Ecclesiastes 3:8. Now, we have a record of this, which appears in the book by Dan Fisher, The Black Robed Regiment. which was written by his nephew, Henry Augustus Muhlenberg, many years later. And he said on his arrival at Woodstock, his different congregations widely scattered along the frontier were notified that upon the following Sabbath, their beloved pastor would deliver his farewell sermon. The appointed day came. The rude country church was filled to overflowing with the hardy mountaineers of their frontier counties, among whom were collected one or more of the independent companies to which the forethought of the convention had given birth. And it goes in to talk about some of the details. In the interest of time, I'll skip down to, though, when he is now preaching on Ecclesiastes 3, in which he says that in the language of Holy Witt there was a time for all things, a time to preach and a time to pray. But those times had passed, and in a voice that re-echoed through the church like a trumpet blast, that there was a time to fight, and that time has now come. When he finished the sermon, there was sort of a stillness that they talk about here, and he then takes off his robe, and in the particular PDF that we have available to you is a picture that a painting that was drawn in which he's taking off his black robe, and underneath his robe is the actual uniform of an officer in the Continental Army. And so it has become now obvious that he is going to leave the pulpit, he's going to leave the pastorate, and he is going to now serve as he does with George Washington. He goes to the back of the room, and here again, reading from the account by his nephew, nearly 300 men of the frontier churches that day enlisted under his banner, and then, of course, went on to serve with him. If you're not familiar with John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, he ends up in almost all the very significant battles with George Washington, all the way to the end in Yorktown. Later, of course, he came back to not only be a pastor, but also a member of Congress in Pennsylvania. And one of the pictures I have here shows a statue. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., there's a statuary hall, and you will see his statue that is there depicting him from Pennsylvania. And on his left side, you will see a sword and see that he is in the uniform of a Continental soldier. But on the right hand, you will see, draped over his arm is his robe as a Lutheran pastor. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you go and spend a little bit of time looking at the story of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, you also know that not only did he serve in Congress, but his brother Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg served in Congress, but not initially. Frederick Muhlenberg, a Lutheran pastor, in this case was in New York, actually expressed to his other brother that he thought Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg was kind of losing his mind. And so as a result, we do have the correspondence of Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg writing to Frederick Muhlenberg, in which he said, "I'm a clergyman, it is true, but I'm also a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as any man. Shall I then sit still and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the continent is spilling? Heaven forbid it." And he goes on to say, "Do you think then if America should be conquered, I should be safe? Nothing less. Would you not sooner fight like a man than die the death of a dog?" Well, after he received that letter, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg's church actually was taken over by the British, and it was burned down. Matter of fact, the British lots of times would burn down the churches because they felt that some of these pastors were causing all of the problems. Others would use the churches as a stable and put horses in there and kind of desecrate the church. And Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg eventually, actually pretty quickly changed his mind, as far as we can tell from his correspondence. Later, not only served in Congress, but also was the first Speaker of the House in Congress. And if you ever go to Washington, D.C., you can, of course, see their statutes. But if you go to the National Archives, you'll see the Declaration of Independence. You'll see the Constitution. And you'll also see the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, you'll see that it's signed by only two people: John Adams, at that time the President of the United States, and Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And I think, again, the idea that maybe politics and religion don't mix, well, these Muhlenberg brothers kind of changed their minds. Let's get to the story of Paul Revere. Again, a very significant date indeed in history, April 18th, 1775. And a lot of people know that he was riding through the countryside saying, "The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming." Where was he headed? Well, that's where I want to tell the story of the pastor, Jonas Clark, because they were headed to Jonas Clark and his home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Why so? Well, in his home that night were Samuel Adams and John Hancock. One of the things was to alert them, because if the British had captured them, they might have publicly executed them, or at the very least might have held them as prisoners and exchanged them for other prisoners. And so this was dangerous to them. But more importantly, both Samuel Adams and John Hancock turned to Jonas Clark and said, if the British are coming and the regulars are coming, you've been training men in your church. Are they ready? Interesting enough, Jonas Clark said, I trained them for this very hour. They would fight and if need be die under the shadow of the house of God. That's because not only did he train them, but the person that probably did the most training was a man by the name of John Parker. He's known as Captain John Parker, but John Parker was a deacon in that church. You have the pastor of that church and the deacon of that church essentially training these individuals. And so when the British eventually made their way to the Lexington Commons, they were met by the Minutemen. Who are the Minutemen? Those are the people trained by Captain John Parker, deacon of that church. And if you ever go to Lexington, you will see a stone there, and on the stone it says what John Parker said to those men standing there: stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here. Well, the British commander was going to have none of it, so he rides up and tells them to throw down their arms in the name of the King of England. Captain Parker and his men responded, we recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. But eventually there was a standoff, and so that's where Captain Parker at that point says, okay, I think we've made our point, so let's leave. And so they turned to leave, but someone fired a flintlock, and that became the shot heard round the world, because then the British opened fire, the militia and the Minutemen returned fire, and before the dust and the smoke had cleared, 8 Americans were dead on the ground and 10 more were wounded. And just as had been predicted, interestingly enough, by Jonas Clark, some of those men indeed died under the shadow of the house of God. Well, then they went on to Concord, and they ran into more of the militia and a battle that took place there. And eventually the British, not being able to find the weapons, because this was kind of gun control of the 18th century, went back to Boston. But as they did, the militia continued to fire on them. And one of the things I have in the PDF file that we're making available is a copy of the sermon that was given a year later on April 19th, 1776 by Pastor Jonas Clark. The sermon was entitled, The Fate of the Bloodthirsty Oppressors and God's Tender Care of His Distressed People. And it's a quote from a number of verses, but one in Proverbs about those who shed innocent blood. So you can see that even one of the more significant conflicts, the shot heard around the world, really is tied back to the pastor, Jonas Clark, and the deacon, whose name, interestingly enough, was Clark himself, Parker, John Parker. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue teaching this hour on the Black Robed Regiment, and if you'd like to follow along, again, we have a PDF file that is available on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, a lot of this comes from the book by Dan Fisher, which I would certainly recommend, Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment. There's also a DVD that goes with it as well. We've talked about Lutherans, talked about Church of Christ. Let's if we can, maybe focus on the Presbyterians for just a minute. Probably the best example would be Reverend James Caldwell, who was pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. He was known as the high priest of the rebellion by the British, and perhaps was one of the most controversial figures for the British because he was always seemingly going out of his way to say something provocative and controversial, and eventually there was a price put on his head. Well, the sad reality is that, first of all, when he was indeed involved in another activity, his wife was killed. And in this book, again, it talks about the fact that when the individual that many people assume was British, since he was wearing a red coat, it could have been someone else, came to the window of Reverend James Caldwell's home, and at the time he was away with the army in a place called Short Hills, this individual came, brought his musket up to his shoulders and shot twice through the window and killed Hannah Caldwell. She had just nursed her child. Matter of fact, the glass hit the child. She falls over with 2 musket balls in her breasts, dead on the bed. James Caldwell is in a distance, and he's actually standing next to General Lafayette, and he looks through an eyeglass towards the Connecticut farms over where he was. Seeing the smoke of burning buildings, said, "Thank God the fire is not in the direction of my home." Unfortunately, he was mistaken. The family and the neighbors drug her out of the house because the British set fire to his home. So when he got back, he found out that she had been killed, so under a white flag comes into there, is able to reclaim his wife's body and actually did a funeral for her. So, first of all, he is now, his children then are put in the care of some of the members of the congregation, the neighbors and family. And so now let's fast forward to a battle that he was participating in when the men were fighting the British at Springfield, New Jersey. And as he rides, we are out of wadding for the muskets. Now, if you're not familiar with a musket, you have to pour some powder into a pan. Matter of fact, if it burns and doesn't fire the ball, it's called a flash in the pan. You ever heard the phrase flash in the pan? Well, that's because there's a lot of flash but no impact. But the wadding is necessary in order to be pushed down into the chamber, so when the explosion takes place, it will actually go a distance, and they no longer had the wadding necessary. So Pastor James Caldwell rides to the Springfield Presbyterian Church, this in a famous painting, some of the hymnals, and begins to throw the hymnals, them to tear out the pages of the hymnals. Many of the hymns at that time were written by Isaac Watts. He says, "Give them Watts, pour Watts into them." Matter of fact, have you ever heard the phrase, "give them what for"? Well, that's where that phrase comes from, "give them Watts for." And so he actually was using the hymnals to create wadding so that they could. So again, James Caldwell was the hero in that day, using the hymnals from Spring. Later on, he was assassinated by a paid assassin, and it's just an illustration again of the fact that we have these individuals who, when they signed the Declaration, said, "We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Many of them lost their lives. Most of them lost their fortunes. but none of them gave up their honor. And again, just an incredible story there as well. And while I'm talking about the Presbyterians, I have some material in there about how the Presbyterians were seen to be the reason for the American Revolution. King George II called the American Revolution a Presbyterian Revolution. The Prime Minister's son at that time, Horace Walpole, said there's no use in crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson. And a colonial supporter of the king actually wrote in one letter, I fix all the blame for these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. They have been the chief and principal instrument in all of these flaming measures. George Bancroft, who is a historian, and I've had a chance to look at some of his historical books in the Dallas Public Library, said the revolution of 1776, so far it was affected by religion, was a Presbyterian measure. And of course, earlier we mentioned that Peter Oliver actually is the first one to give credit for using the title, the Black Robed Regiment. So as we're winding down in this hour, I wanted to at least focus on a few key figures in the American Revolution. I could talk about a lot more of the pastors, but let me move from a pastor to a man by the name of John Adams. Well, who was John Adams? Well, John Adams, first of all, was one of those individuals put on a committee to actually draft the Declaration of Independence. That committee included such people as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and others. And John Adams then later served as the first vice president of the United States under General George Washington, later served as the second president of the United States, and later his son served as a president of the United States as well. Well, in 1818, he wrote an essay called The Meaning of the American Revolution because he wanted people to understand what were the ideas that led to the American Revolution. And he said the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the mind and hearts of the people and a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. And he lists a number of men that were responsible for the revival of the American principles that led to the American Revolution. Talks about John Locke and the writings of him. But two people that he mentioned that are mentioned fairly prominently are Dr. Samuel Cooper and Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. And unless you are a real student of American history, you've got to say, who are these individuals? Well, it turns out that Dr. Samuel Cooper was the pastor of Brattle Street Church. Two very prominent members of his church were John Hancock, and Samuel Adams was a friend, and also John Adams. So you had John Hancock and John Adams, who were members of the church, and of course close friends with Samuel Adams, who is oftentimes seen as one of the key figures in the American Revolution, and he also corresponded regularly with Benjamin Franklin. The other is Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, who has oftentimes been referred to as the father of civil and religious liberty in Massachusetts and America. He oftentimes gave what were called election sermons, and those are still traditions that sometimes are held to this day, that on election day or the Sunday before, they'll give a sermon, not to tell you who to vote for, but giving you biblical principles to use when you go and vote. And in 1750 and 1754, those election sermons were very significant. And as a matter of fact, in one of those sermons in 1750, he came up with a phrase that we've heard to this very day: no taxation without representation. Where did that idea come from? Well, it came from one of the pulpits in the 18th century. He opposed the Stamp Act and urged the necessity of actually securing liberty and this idea of no taxation without representation. Some of his members of the congregation eventually dressed up as Indians, went on a ship, and took the tea and threw it into the harbor, known as, of course, the Boston Tea Party. But his most famous sermon, which we have because they would write out their sermons, reprint them, and distribute them, was a sermon that actually took place many years before the American Revolution, and it was a sermon called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. It was a sermon, quite frankly, that helped many of the Christians think about, is there ever a time when we could disobey government? After all, disobeying the crown could be considered treason. Is that even possible? And he takes them through. Moses is a good example of civil disobedience. He was alive only because of the Hebrew midwives disobeying the government. 3 different times in the book of Daniel, we have civil disobedience. Even in the New Testament, we have Acts 5:29. We will obey God rather than men. And so he said it was a Christian duty not only to begin to obey government, but in those cases where government has exceeded its authority, when government has become tyrannical, when we have unjust rulers, it's not only the right, but it's the duty of a Christian to oppose unjust leaders. Well, when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one other very key individual. His name was John Witherspoon, and then talk about what's the possible application of all of this to our day as well. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to listen to this again, of course, the podcast is available. If you'd like to find the PDF, it's available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation about the Black Robed Regiment right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The long wait to see what kind of a judge President Trump would appoint to the nation's highest court is now over. Just ahead looms the confirmation battle for Judge Neil Gorsuch. His qualifications for the office are unquestionable. With degrees from Columbia, Harvard, and Oxford, there can be little doubt about his intelligence. But what about his record as a judge? Well, at First Liberty Institute, we have one criterion for evaluating judicial candidates. Does his record reflect a history of upholding the Constitution, especially as to religious liberty? Well, I'm happy to say that it does. Judge Gorsuch wrote enjoined opinions supporting the rights of ministries like Little Sisters of the Poor and closely held family businesses like Hobby Lobby to be free from the burden imposed by the HHS abortion pill mandate. He wrote or signed opinions upholding the constitutionality of the public display of Ten Commandments monuments, and even wrote an opinion defending the existence of cross-shaped memorials for fallen state troopers. Whether Neil Gorsuch will adequately fill the shoes of the late Justice Scalia is impossible to fully predict. What we can say with some confidence is that Judge Gorsuch has a history of defending the First Amendment from the bench. We hope that Justice Gorsuch will live up to the American people's expectation and strongly protect our constitutional freedoms. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Come back for a few more minutes as we conclude our conversation today about the Black Robed Regiment. Let me just mention that the book by Dan Fisher is 400 pages. No way we could possibly cover all of that in an hour, but I wanted to give you a few highlights. And if nothing else, come down to the last couple of moments to, again, maybe focus on one or two other individuals and maybe an application. One of those individuals is a man by the name of John Witherspoon. Now, he is significant in a number of ways. Not only was he a minister, but he was also the president of what today we would call Princeton. Back then it was College of New Jersey, but again, that what eventually became Princeton University. But he also was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. For people that say, well, I think pastors should stay out of politics, here is a pastor who actually was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But more importantly, as I've talked about on this program before, his profound influence as a teacher is immense. First of all, the most significant person who studied under him is a man by the name of James Madison. James Madison, of course, is known as the architect of the Constitution. Very significant in terms of his involvement in the writing, the drafting of the Constitution. Later, of course, served as a president as well. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. But he also taught 77 other members of Congress. He taught 3 Supreme Court justices. But if you will, his political pilgrimage is significant. Because even up to, I think, the early part of 1776, he wasn't quite sure that we should be engaged in separating from England. This was, of course, a very dramatic action. To actually leave and have the colonies separate from England was a treasonous act. And so it was something that individuals had to think through. And I just mentioned a minute ago Jonathan Mayhew's influence in that regard. But eventually he did conclude that this was something that should be done and preached perhaps one of the more famous sermons during 1776 called The Dominion of Providence over the Affairs of Men, and actually preached that on May 17th, 1776. Of course, when you talk about July 4th, 1776, of course, that is the commemoration of the Declaration of Independence. And so this was something that he concluded must be done and should be done. And it's interesting because one time a member said, I don't think we're ripe for revolution. Well, Witherspoon replied, "Not ripe, sir. In my judgments, we're not only ripe, but unless some action is taken, we will be rotting." So again, I think what you can see as we've gone through some of this is to recognize that we really are talking about the fact that pastors in the 18th century were very influential. In other presentations I've given, I've pointed out that some of the sermons that were given by the pastors of the 18th century were later actually cited and quoted from in the writings of the founders. So many of the ideas that were preached from the pulpits of the 18th century eventually found their way into the debate and the discussion that gave us the Constitution. So these pastors were very bold. Now, one of the reasons Dan Fisher put his book together as well as his DVD was because he's convinced, as we are, that pastors, let's be honest and say that many pastors do indeed do that. Matter of fact, many of them have been on this program, so let's give credit where credit is due. Many pastors do address these issues from the pulpit from time to time, but most do not, and that needs to change. So if there's an application point, we are calling for pastors to be bold, just as their predecessors in the 18th century were. But what about you? You may not be a pastor. What can you do? Well, I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, that's just a national issue. Maybe I can support some of these groups that are religious liberty groups. Maybe I can support pastors. Maybe I can make sure I at least vote for the right people in elections. And all of that is indeed true. But let me use one illustration that Kelly Shackelford has used before. Even in your local community, there's something you can do. Kelly Shackelford's been on our program many times before at First Liberty and heard about this actual senior center down the road, not far from where we're broadcasting, where the seniors in that senior center were told, you cannot pray, you cannot have a Bible study, you cannot have worship songs. Why? Because government funds are actually going to the senior center and you cannot do that. And this was the stand of these 4 individuals who were on the city council. Well, Kelly sent one of his associates to go down and check it out and came back and said, I don't want to educate them. I want to destroy them. And Kelly said, no, we don't want to do that. But he said, let's, send out a letter of demand and explain why this is not an unconstitutional establishment of religion. There was no movement. So finally they decided to file a lawsuit and they had a press conference. And if you've ever seen the press conference, Kelly's speaking, and at the end, he does something I wouldn't recommend you do, because behind him are all the various seniors from the senior center, and he says, did anybody have anything to say? Well, Barney at the end there, he's got a cowboy hat on, he's got a bolo tie, he's got boots. He comes up and he says, I fought in World War II, and I didn't fight so that I had to pray in the corner. So if they want to arrest me, they can arrest me, but they have to put on the arrest warrant that I was arrested for praying. Well, that kind of got everybody's attention. The media blew up. A couple hours later, Kelly got a call from Bill O'Reilly saying, we want to put you on our program and bring the guy in the cowboy hat. Well, eventually, of course, what happened is that they were able to be successful and say that indeed they could have religious studies and all sorts of events at the senior center. But then the people in the community said, you know, these 4 city council people, they just are not exactly the people we're real thrilled about. So they held a recall election and removed them from office. And I heard more recently that Kelly said that one of those seniors sitting behind him, standing behind him, actually is on the city council now. So I think there is a need for us to encourage pastors to speak to the issues of the day. We need to know how to articulate a biblical point of view. We need to know how to defend a biblical point of view, and that's what Point of View is all about. And so we really want to be a resource for you. But also, as you go to the website, you'll see some of the information about the book, and you can also get the DVD, and maybe even if you'd like to listen to this again, the podcast is available. So certainly we need to encourage pastors to take a stand for truth. But you know what? I think it's also important for us to take a stand for truth as well. And not just to be aware of how a particular candidate stands on the issues, as important as that is, and we'll continue to provide all sorts of resources for you so that you know where individuals stand on those issues, but also how important it is for you to stand up for the issues and recognize that God may be calling you to get involved. And it may not be to run for Congress, may not be to run for the city council or the school board. It might be just for you to work in a particular campaign, or to express your opinion, or to learn a little bit more about what's going on in your community, and to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But if nothing else, I hope that this hour really gave you a desire to learn a little bit more about our history. And as you learn our history, you can recognize that there were courageous individuals in the past who were willing to stand on God's word and willing to stand on truth to make a difference in their community. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, as always, we encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, first of all, of course, you can go back and download the podcast and listen to this again, or you can send it to someone else. Of course, there's a share button there as well. You can watch the program again. And of course, the PDF is available to you. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let me also say that we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. So let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and click on that button that says donate, because after all, if you appreciate these kind of teaching programs, we're going to do more of those, and your financial support makes that possible. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. You know, one of the things we talk about so often here on Point of View is to have the right thinking, the right worldview. But we've also spent some time talking about what happens if you don't have a biblical worldview, and especially if your brain begins to work in the wrong direction. We've had Kurt Thompson on, for example, talking about his book, The Anatomy of the Soul. And I think we're even going to be replaying one of the interviews I did with him on a book, The Soul of Shame, on the 4th of July. So this is something that we have talked about on the program. And so when this new book, The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life, came across my desk, I said, we've got to get Dr. Timothy Jennings on the program. Might just mention Kurt Thompson actually is one of the individuals that has endorsed this book. It is published by InterVarsity Press. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Timothy Jennings, he is a board-certified Christian psychiatrist as well as a psychopharmacologist, individual that received his MD degree from the University of Tennessee College of Medicine in Memphis. He completed his psychiatric residency at Eisenhower Army Medical Center in Augusta, Georgia. He lives in Chattanooga and is an individual that you can find at comeandreason.com. And Dr. Timothy Jennings, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, and thanks for having me.
I appreciate the work that you've done, and the website we have pointed you people to is something I think is going to be really helpful. But let's, if we can, just talk about how our brains are even more important than we think they are. Of course, I think anybody recognizes the fact that you're able to talk right now, that you're able to breathe right now, that your muscles all work, all go to your brain. But even in the preface, there is just some really striking illustrations you're using about individuals who were convinced that they were going to die, even though there was nothing necessarily medically wrong with them. In one case, by thinking that he had a voodoo curse on him and had to convince him in a rather bizarre way that he didn't. Another individual that was diagnosed with liver cancer when that wasn't the case. Sometimes people, because they think they're going to die or because they think they're sick, actually become sick and sometimes die. It just shows how powerful our brains are, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. Our brain, of course, is wired into every aspect of our physical body, and therefore what happens in our brain is transmitted and can be transmitted into our body. So the beliefs we hold are extremely powerful. As I say in the book, we have power over what we believe, meaning we can choose what we believe, but be careful, because once you believe it, that belief then exerts power back over you.
Well, again, that I think is really a striking illustration of the fact that sometimes when people think they're going to die, they really die because their bodies just shut down and their brains shut down. So if it's true that your brain can kill you, if you want to be so blunt about it for just a moment, then how much more important it is to have the right thoughts in your brain. Otherwise, there'll be consequences to not having proper thoughts. And if a sermon illustration is necessary for any pastor this Sunday, I think we just gave it to him, didn't we?
That's exactly right. And I think, we're talking about the acute sudden death of somebody maybe who has got like the voodoo curse that we talked about here, the frightening death. But what we describe in the book is that chronic unhealthy beliefs will kill you, but they'll just kill you a lot slower.
Yes. Well, again,
undermining your health.
Yeah, let me guess if I can get into that. First of all, let's talk about the fact that you are a believer. So, coming into this whole area of mind-brain interaction is important, because one of the things, Timothy, that I've talked about is that if you go to a lot of bookstores right now, one of the real challenges to the Christian faith is found in the psychology section, because you have all these people writing saying everything we now know from brain studies says there's no soul. Actually, there's no free will. You think you have free will, but you're really just a meat computer that's determining everything that you think and do and believe. And so it's really important for me to have people like you and Kurt Thompson and others out there saying, wait a minute, that's not what the studies show at all. And if anything, just the opposite. We now know a lot more about our brains, and that really argues for the fact that we certainly do have a soul, we do have choices, and God does hold us responsible for our actions. Fair?
Well, you're exactly right. In fact, what the brain science shows is that it is your mind, your individuality, your unique identity or personhood that actually directs the firing of the brain. So if you were to decide, for instance, you're not genetically pre-wired, and your brain is not pre-wired for you to read ancient hieroglyphics or play the piano or learn how to play chess. But if you decide, if you personally, because you meet a friend, because you have an interest, decide to do those things, your brain will begin rewiring and making new pathways that as you practice those behaviors, you get more and more proficient at doing it. So your brain actually follows the direction of your individuality. It doesn't determine your individuality.
Okay, now since we started with the idea that you're a Christian, the whole first section of your book is the God, the brain, and what went wrong. Because we live in a fallen world, and our brains, though we like to think that they're really efficient and functioning well, are still part of the fall. Where does our biblical view of the fall fit into all of that?
So my view is that God is love, and God is the creator of all things, and as a being of love, he created his universe to operate in harmony with himself. That's his design, and it's not just compassion as far as an emotion. As I describe in the book, it's a design protocol, and the Bible describes it as the principle of giving or beneficence. It's not self-seeking, it's other-seeking. And I give examples. I'll give you just one quick one. Every breath you take, you give away carbon dioxide to the plants, and the plants give oxygen back to you, a never-ending circle of giving upon which life is constructed to operate. You are still free, however, to transgress the law. You could take a plastic bag, tie it over your head, and selfishly hoard your carbon dioxide to yourself, but the wages of that is death. God's original design was for humankind to live in a face-to-face relationship with him that lived in perfect harmony with his design's, creation's constructs, which are always true love. Now, what happened, as I described in the book, is if you were in a loving marriage relationship with you and your spouse, and somebody told you a lie that your spouse is having an affair, even though it's not true, if you believe the lie, does something inside of you change? And so lies believed break the circle of love and trust. And broken love and trust result in fear and selfishness. I don't trust you anymore. I think you're with somebody else. You're not getting in bed with me tonight. I'm getting to the bank, get the money before you do. I've got to watch out for myself because you don't have my back anymore, all based on believing a lie. That drive is known as survival of the fittest, fear and selfishness, drive to survive. That's an infection to God's creation, and Paul describes it as the law of sin and death.
Wow. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to talk about, okay, when we have love, God's love, but then we have broken love, and that gets us into fear and kind of the alarm system that we have in our bodies and stress and those kinds of issues. And again, part of this book is really an attempt to try to help you understand that we know a lot more about the brain. And in some respects, because we do, it correlates very well with Scripture. So the first section we're looking at the moment is God, the brain, and what went wrong. Then the second section, the battle between the conflicting views about God. And then the third section is embracing the goodness of God. And I think it's going to be not only helpful in terms of understanding what happens in our brains, our minds, and our souls, but also understanding some of these interesting things that are described in Scripture, which now in the 21st century, I think, make a lot more sense. So again, it's all part of this new book. It's published by InterVarsity Press. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link there as well as a link to his website, comeandreason.com. It's entitled The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It is hard to imagine how a coffee house in Laurel, Maryland would be controversial. After all, the Ragamuffins Coffee House is known for not only serving coffee, but also for serving up a special blend of community service and worship. Apparently, it is that last item that started all the controversy. The local church opened the doors to the coffee house and opened its arms to reach out to the homeless and needy families in the community. But a new city ordinance banned them from holding any services in the building. Apparently, offering coffee 6 days a week was fine, but offering an extra shot of God on Sunday was not. Christiana Holcomb, legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, joined me on the Point of View radio talk show to explain why they had to seek legal action. The city adopted new zoning codes with the express intention of stopping the church from operating in the city's downtown area. First, it banned nonprofit organizations, but then changed the law to make houses of worship restricted to second-class zoning. The current law forces churches and other Christian organizations to submit to an expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain special exemption. This is a process not imposed on other secular organizations. What happened to this church and its coffee house is hardly an exception. Churches, home Bible studies, and Christian schools have had local governments use zoning laws to restrict their activities and even shut them down. Fortunately, there are some encouraging signs. Various religious liberty groups such as ADF, First Liberty Institute, and the American Center for Law and Justice are taking these cases, and the Justice Department has announced a place of worship initiative that would enforce religious protections. This is good news for churches and Christian outreaches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Timothy Jennings with us today as we talk about the God-shaped brain, how changing your view of God transform your life. And one of the things we want to talk about is where things went wrong. And when we look at fear and selfishness, that resulted in sin. And you even point out that ultimately those acts of sin can damage your mind, your character, even your body, because, of course, in Romans 6:23, it says the wages of sin is death. So we're talking about believing a lie, and we're talking about some of the stress, tension, and difficulties that ultimately result from any kind of fallen world that we are in and the sinful actions that we sometimes pursue. So explain that, if you might.
Yeah, so what God is trying to achieve, as I understand it, through, of course, Jesus Christ, is that he is trying to restore in us his original designs, which are the motives of love and trust. He wants our love, he wants our trust, he wants our loyalty, he wants our friendship, and he wants us to experience that type of living even while we're in a physiology that is fallen, that still has genetic mutations in it, is subject to disease. And so we can have that new heart right spirit, get a new way of relating towards others and functioning even while we are still in a fallen world. And so we don't get the new physiology, the new biology, until the mortal puts on immortality and the corruption puts in corruption at the second coming. But we do get a new mind, a new heart, a new desire, a new set of motives, and a new wisdom, discernment in our decision-making.
Let's, if we can, then maybe take some of these scripture verses together, and that is it possible that our thoughts can rewire our brains? Because after all, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that we should take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And it seems to me now that here's another illustration of now in the 21st century, we understand that the brains are more plastic. We could talk about neuroplasticity, and we've talked about how watching lots of violent video games or spending lots of time in front of a computer or your smartphone isn't necessarily healthy. And it seems to me now that we understand it really is important how you think, because it isn't the brain that causes your thoughts. In some cases, it's your thoughts that rewire your brain. True?
That's exactly right. In fact, it's not some cases. It's really in all cases. Your brain doesn't determine your thoughts. Your thoughts determine what kind of brain you get, the choices you make, what you watch, what you observe, the God that you worship, the relationships you're in. And so there's a design law. God is a designer, and his laws are the laws upon which reality are built. We can call them the laws of health, the laws of physics, but one of them is the law of exertion. If you want something to get stronger, you must exercise it, because if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right.
Well, that's true. That's not just true for your muscles. It's true for your brain circuits. If you want stronger math ability, you got to work problems. Musical skill, you've got to practice your instrument. And so when you exercise neural circuits, those circuits will grow stronger. Studies have been done where they put people in an MRI scanner where they can functionally in real time, or a PET scanner, in real time where we can see which neural circuits are firing, and have them play a musical piece of instrument. And then they will take the instrument away and have them imagine playing the same music in their mind, and we see the same circuits firing. Well, we can take a pedophile and we can lock them in prison where they cannot behaviorally act out on their desires. But can we control what they imagine? No. And so if they spend 20 years in prison imagining the dastardly deeds, they will come out a more recidivist pedophile than they went in. That's what Paul was referring to about bringing every thought into captivity to Jesus Christ. If we want to actually experience genuine transformation and change, we can't simply do behavior modification. We actually have to change the thinking processes.
Well, and again, you don't have to go to Paul. You can go to the Old Testament. In Proverbs, it says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So we recognize that in some respects, some of these important biblical principles in the Old Testament, as well as important biblical principles in the New Testament, are now in some respects really being validated by our brain studies. And what would you say then to the person who rejects that and says, I can sit in front of television for hours and I can watch all sorts of movies, I can watch lots of violence, or a young person that says, I watch a lot of pornography, it doesn't affect me at all. We now know those kinds of comments are just not scientifically accurate. Don't we know that now?
So yes, we do know that. And so what you say to somebody like that is, well, you are free to believe anything you want, but your belief doesn't make that a reality. I have one patient who believes that cigarette smokes helps her lungs work better. Well, she's free to believe that, but that belief is not as healthy as knowing the reality that cigarette smokes damage your lungs. And so the same thing is happening with what you've described there. Yes, people who want to persist in behaviors because they get some pleasure, some reward out of it, are often resistant to light, to truth, to evidence. As Jesus say, those are in the darkness don't want to come into the light lest their evil deeds be exposed. And so there is this level of denial that some people live in, but that doesn't change how reality works.
The book is entitled The God-Shaped Brain, and the first section we've only just kind of touched on, but there's some great material here, God, the Brain, and What Went Wrong. But I want to move to at least the second section, and that is the battle between the conflicting views about God, because the subtitle is How Changing Your View About God Transforms Your Life. If people, Dr. Jennings, have an incomplete or inaccurate view of God, how does that affect their brains and their behavior?
Well, this is another one of the design laws, and I call it the law of worship. In the Bible, it's described by beholding, we become changed. Psychiatry and psychology describes it as modeling. But neurobiologically, we actually change neurologically, neurobiologically, characterologically to become like what we admire, worship, spend time viewing. And so the God that you worship will change you physiologically and characterologically. Worship an authoritarian God, a dictator God, an angry God, a punishing God, and you actually become more authoritarian. Worship a benevolent God, a God of compassion, forgiveness, grace, love that Jesus revealed. You become more compassionate, more gracious, more kind, more Christ-like. And so the view of God you hold really ultimately will determine the kind of person you become. And there's multiple studies that show this.
Well, okay, let's deal with another aspect, and we'll go to the book of Romans. It's what you call the battle in the converted brain. Now, we recognize that from the moment of conversion, we have what's called justification by faith. But then you have sanctification, and the healing transformation of our lives usually happens gradually, steadily over time. Sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes there are addictions and difficulties and those kinds of things. But the Apostle Paul, certainly a great model for us, nevertheless says, I find myself sometimes doing the very things that I hate. So that brings us back to the idea that even in an individual whose heart and soul are converted, their brain and their body still are fighting a war with them. True?
Yes, and so the real key, you say justification. Justification, when you justify the margins on your Word document, you're setting those things that are out of line back in line. Paul tells us in Romans that the natural condition of the sinful heart is enmity against God. We don't trust him. And so it says in Romans 4 that Abraham trusted God, and after his heart had been changed from enmity or distrust into a heart that trusted, then God recognized him as righteous. And so the setting right was setting Abraham right in his heart to trust God. Once he trusts God, Romans 5, it says we open our heart and God pours his love into our heart. The healing, transforming process only happens when we've been won back to trust in God, had our hearts justified or set right with him. And that's really what the Bible is trying to describe, what we describe in the book.
Again, what the things that I'd like to talk about maybe when we come back from the break is what you talk about in terms of engaging the battle, because again, there is a tendency for some of us to say, well, once I became a Christian, then I'll just kind of go on about my life. But if we really want to be individuals that are followers of Jesus Christ, then we recognize that we really are engaging a battle. So I want to come back and get into that in a little more detail, because that's part of section 2. Love strikes back, engaging the battle. Love stands firm, changing our view of God, the power of truth, the truth about sin, enlarging our view about God, the judgment of God, and in the brain of Christ. So just a lot of great material in that middle section, section 2, and then we'll get into embracing the goodness of God, and it's all part of this book, The God-Shaped Brain. If you find yourself saying, okay, you've convinced me, I really want to read a little bit more, as we learn more about the brains, we learn more about what Paul was teaching even in the New Testament, and certainly understanding what Jesus was calling for us to do as believers. So again, just a fascinating book that takes that in a little more detail in a way that I think you're going to find helpful. And again, we also have a link to his website, comeandreason.com, which is available at our website, pointofview.net. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to find a copy of that book, you may be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link that is available there, which gives you a chance to either get a copy of it on paperback, or, of course, there's also a Kindle version as well. And, of course, we have a link to his website. So some great resources available. So take the time to go to our website, pointofview.net. Find out a little bit more, and I've even posted one of my commentaries that deals with the whole idea of neuroethics and brain studies and all sorts of other issues that I think we're going to have to really fight and really give a Christian answer for in the 21st century. We'll talk more about sanctification, Christian growth, and how that relates to these brain studies right after these messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Timothy Jennings, and again we have a link to his website, comeandreason.com. The book we're talking about is The God-Shaped Brain, but you'll also see information about the aging brain, and that's another issue, Dr. Jennings, certainly as an individual that has to use his brain every day in live radio, which will keep you on your toes. And having had a father that had Alzheimer's, I've paid a lot of attention to doing things that keep my brain active. I take various supplements and those kinds of issues because, after all, we can do what we can with the resources that God has placed in our hands, and I think we should be a good steward of our bodies. And one very important element of our bodies is our brains. If our brains don't function, life goes down pretty quickly, doesn't it?
It sure does, and that's what motivated me to write the book, The Aging Brain, Proven Steps to Prevent Dementia and Sharpen Your Mind. The good news is that with our current science, even if you have a family history of Alzheimer's dementia, which my wife has, and that's what really motivated me to really dig into this research, if you make the right lifestyle choices, you will not progress to Alzheimer's dementia later in life. It really is a combination of genetic vulnerability and lifestyle choices together, and we have the power to make the right choices to not experience that devastating disease, even with a family history of it. So I hope people will take advantage of that and keep themselves from that terrible outcome.
Again, comeandreason.com. We have a link on the website. You can find a number of the books and resources and ebooks and some of the blog posts and all the rest, and it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We've talked a little bit about, again, sanctification. Let's get back into that, and we've talked about the importance of engaging the battle and some of the other issues, but help us out because we really need to change our view of God and really have a biblical view of truth. Talk about how those are such important ingredients in terms of having a God-honoring lifestyle, but also a brain that functions most effectively.
Most Christians kind of know this, but they don't really see how it works. But, as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, they ran and hid because they were afraid. Perfect love casts out all fear. So there is this inverse relationship, both neurobiologically and biblically, between the fear drive survival, because fear turns us to self. The more fearful we become, the more self-centered and self-protective we become. The greater love we have, the less selfish we are, and the more we're willing to help others. And so there's this tension, both neurobiologically and the way our brain circuits fire. When our love circuits fire, they actually turn off our fear circuits. So when we have views of God that actually incite fear, terror, dread, concern with me, what's going to happen to me, are my sins going to be cared for, will I be punished in the judgment, when we become very self-referenced, there's probably something wrong with our view of God. But when we come to see God in such a way that we lose sight of ourselves, we are just caught up in a love relationship with an amazing God who cares so much for us that our fears tend to fade away. We're probably really moving in a right direction with our constructs of God.
That's so well said. And again, a lot of that you can find in the truth about truth and the power of truth and the view of God. But let me get another truth on the table, and that's chapter 10, the truth about sin. First of all, we tend to minimize the impact of sin, but what have you learned in terms of some of the brain studies and how sin affects both our body, our souls, and our minds?
There's this idea that is almost ubiquitous in the world that sin is behavioral and legal. That's what's the problem. You get in trouble because you've broken a rule, and the authority's going to hold you in charge, hold you accountable for it, rather than realizing that sin actually damages the sinner themselves. And many of my patients that I'm dealing with who are recovering from sexual abuse, as you know from hearing the news, it's very common. 1 out of 3 girls by the time they're 20 will have been sexually molested or abused in some way. So very, very common. And most of the time, the perpetrators are not prosecuted. The story is not told. They're not caught. And so many of my patients, as they're working through that, we have to come to some point where they have to deal with the issue of forgiveness so they can lay down their bitterness and anger and resentment. And oftentimes the barrier to that is, but it's not fair. If I forgive, they get away with it. I'm going to hold them accountable. And so I help them with this by asking a question. I say, imagine God took you to heaven, and he gave you one choice between 2 options. Option 1, he sends you back to earth and nothing's changed in your life. Option 2, God says, I'll let you go back to earth, but you get to trade lives with the man who abused you. You get to go around abusing kids, but no one abuses you. Whose life would you prefer? And they all choose their own. And see, there's this idea goes off in their mind. They realize that when somebody injures you, sins against you, they can hurt your body, they can hurt your psychology, they can hurt your emotions, but they cannot damage your soul. When you sin against another person, you sear your conscience, you harden your heart, you sully your soul, you actually make yourself more unlike God over the course of time, and it's unavoidable. And when you realize that sin always damages the sinner, no one ever gets away with it. Our only choice is to turn to God, the Creator, who can heal and restore us even if we've sinned. Or if we reject Him, we can't avoid the damaging and damning consequences.
Talking with Dr. Timothy Jennings about his book, The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. And one of your chapters talks about really enlarging your view of God. We've, in some respects, talked about having a false view of God, but there's another aspect of this, which we've talked about recently with one of our other guests, that our view of God is too small. Our view of God is too parochial. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, this often comes out with my patients who have struggled with some type of a sickness, perhaps, and they're a faithful believer, and they've prayed for a miracle and prayed for healing. And then when it hasn't come, either they themselves or maybe somebody in their church has suggested, well, maybe they don't have enough faith.
Yes.
And this fear of their faith starts to come along. And as I step back, I help them explore what actually evidence of Scripture shows. And this is what the evidence of Scripture shows, that almost all the time a miracle is performed, it's performed for the weak in faith, not for the strong in faith, but it's often performed through the strong in faith. Gideon wanted his fleece miracle, not because he had great faith, but because his faith was weak and it needed reinforcing. Elijah, with the great man of faith who calls fire down from heaven, the miracle was not for Elijah. It was for all the people who were stuck in Baal worship, the weak in faith. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their miracles were not personally for them, even though they did personally benefit. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, even to Nebuchadnezzar, we know our God can deliver us from the fire, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow. They didn't know that God would. They had faith enough for them to die without it. But Nebuchadnezzar, who was a pagan god, a pagan ruler, worshiping pagan gods, needed the miracle. And you will find in the New Testament, the apostles, all but John, died martyrs, but many miracles were performed through them for the weak in faith. And so I tell people that if you didn't get a miracle, it might be that God knows you don't need a miracle to still trust him, that he can trust you to stay faithful, and that maybe through that experience he can use you to reach a doctor, a nurse, somebody that you will meet in your healthcare experience that would have never had the gospel brought to them.
Yes, and again, you've got a long section in there, which I wish we had more time to go through, but I think people can read that and learn just a little bit more about why miracles take place. And again, many of those miracles were authenticating the various gospel messages, either in the Old or New Testament. But while we talk about this idea of enlarging your view of God, there's another part of that, and as you refer to it, some people see God as a policeman in the sky. What about this idea of the judgment of God and God's judgment on our lives?
Right, and so ultimately, I think most people know, Paul says in Romans 14, every person should be fully persuaded in their own mind. And what's the ultimate thing that we need to be persuaded about? Well, in Romans chapter 3, verse 4, Paul says, God, may you be proved right when you are judged. What? God being judged? The idea is, don't each one of us have to make a judgment or a decision on whether we can trust God or not. He stands at the door and knock, and we have to decide we're going to open the heart. And so this idea that God's judgment ultimately has a reference back to him reaching out through Christ and the Holy Spirit and all that he's been doing to persuade us, to win us, to woo us back to trust him. And so back to the example I gave you earlier, if you had been lied to about your spouse and you've been believing that your spouse has been cheating even though she hasn't been, your spouse loves you and wants you back, and you've moved out because you believed a lie, now what will your spouse have to do to get you back? Won't she have to prove her innocence even though she's done nothing wrong? And that's God's position. He's done no wrong, of course, but we haven't trusted him because Satan's the father of lies. We believe lies. And so God has been working through all of his means and agencies, ultimately through Jesus, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, to expose the lies of Satan and to win us back to trust in him.
We need to take a break. When we come back, we'll finish off a section that deals with embracing the goodness of God. And if you're just joining us, I would encourage you to listen to the podcast again, because the first section we talked about a little bit, God, the brain, and what went wrong, and really help us understand some of the circumstances we find ourselves in right now, theologically and also medically. Then we've been looking at the battle between the conflicting views about God, and only dipped in a couple of places, but you can get a sense of what is there. But when we come back, I want to talk about the goodness of God, and in particular, to learn how to embrace it. All part of the book, The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. Dr. Timothy Jennings with us, and again, we encourage you, if you'd like to know more, to visit his website, which is comeandreason.com. Of course, we find that in the book of Isaiah, comeandreason.com. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dr. Jennings right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The long wait to see what kind of a judge President Trump would appoint to the nation's highest court is now over. Just ahead looms the confirmation battle for Judge Neil Gorsuch. His qualifications for the office are unquestionable. With degrees from Columbia, Harvard, and Oxford, there can be little doubt about his intelligence. But what about his record as a judge? Well, at First Liberty Institute, we have one criterion for evaluating judicial candidates. Does his record reflect a history of upholding the Constitution, especially as to religious liberty? Well, I'm happy to say that it does. Judge Gorsuch wrote and joined opinions supporting the rights of ministries like Little Sisters of the Poor and closely held family businesses like Hobby Lobby to be free from the burden imposed by the HHS abortion pill mandate. He wrote or signed opinions upholding the constitutionality of the public display of Ten Commandments monuments, and even wrote an opinion defending the existence of cross-shaped memorials for fallen state troopers. Whether Neil Gorsuch will adequately fill the shoes of the late Justice Scalia is impossible to fully predict. What we can say with some confidence is that Judge Gorsuch has a history of defending the First Amendment from the bench. We hope that Justice Gorsuch will live up to the American people's expectation and strongly protect our constitutional freedoms. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Timothy Jennings with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. The third section deals with embracing the goodness of God. And Dr. Jennings, first of all, you talk about the importance of forgiveness. Tell us more.
Yes, and so I don't think it's possible to go through this world without experiencing some wrong. And then once a wrong happens to us, we have a decision to make. Do we hold on to that, or do we rid ourselves of that? And so sin is insidious. When somebody does us wrong, it plants a little seed in our heart that tempts us to become angry, bitter, hateful towards the other person. If we don't root that out, then we actually become like the person who wronged us. And so God gave us a tool to root out the bitterness, the anger, the resentment, and that tool is forgiving them. And as we forgive them, it doesn't mean what they did was right. It means that we refuse to allow their evil to infect our hearts.
And again, very important principle. Sometimes I say to individuals, you should forgive, even if for no other reason, just for the selfish reason that it will no longer affect you in a negative way, even regardless of the impact that has on the other individual. So again, just an important chapter, but let's talk about a couple more. When good prevails, and also when love burns free. Those are some important principles as well in terms of understanding the goodness of God.
So one of the most important things to really try to get to the root between the good picture of God and what I think is and what the neuroscience shows is a harmful picture of God is, do you see God as creator, the builder of reality, and thus his laws are the laws of physics, the laws of health, and his moral laws are all design laws upon which life works best. His laws do not function like human laws. We cannot make reality, so we make up rules and we threaten to punish people who won't follow our rules. Humans can make laws to make tobacco and marijuana legal. We can never pass laws to make them healthy. That's the difference between God's laws and man's laws. You can never avoid the damaging consequence to violating God's laws, and thus when you understand that, God is always in the role of redeemer, healer, Savior, seeking to restore his children back to his perfection, and all sin is deviation or transgression of the law or deviation from God's design, which if unremedied, unhealed, undelivered from, results in ruin and death. It's a completely different picture than sin is a legal trouble, and therefore we're in trouble with God, who becomes the source of pain and suffering and inflicted injury upon us, and therefore we need theologies to protect us from God. And much of Christianity has bought into this kind of a view that actually incites fear of God rather than being fearful of the sin itself.
Very well said. And it kind of relates to a chapter which, if you haven't read it, you kind of scratch your head a little bit, because it's entitled Buddha, Jesus, and Preparing Your Brain for Eternity. And I think, first of all, you start out by the fact that there are all sorts of individuals that are saying, well, look at the benefits of Eastern meditation. Even churches have bought into this. We've talked about this before, but it also brings us back to what only Jesus can do and Buddhist Eastern meditation and other kinds of things cannot do. Explain, if you might.
Exactly. So one of the things that the Bible teaches in Hebrews chapter 2:14 is that by Jesus' death, he destroys him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and frees them who all their lives were held in the slavery of the fear of death. I don't know if you know how the history of Buddhism came along, but Buddha left the confines of his home and saw a sick man, a decrepit man, and a dead man, and he became aware of his own mortality and became afraid of dying. And that led him to seek a deliverance from his fear of dying, which led to his Eastern forms of meditation, ultimately led to this whole Eastern religious pursuits, with the central core being Eastern meditation practices. And in the book, I described in the brain what happens in Eastern meditation practice, but let me just cut to the chase. Eastern meditation practices do treat the symptom of fear. If you practice them, your fear will go down. You will have less anxiety, less worry, less stress. However, you still have the terminal condition. Mm-hmm. What Jesus did is he who knew no sin, became sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. Through Jesus Christ, he cured the condition, and through him we can have eternal life. We can actually, Jesus overcame death, and it says in Timothy, he destroyed death and brought life and immortality to light. And so the big difference, Eastern meditation treats the symptoms. Through Jesus Christ, we have a cure for the condition.
Again, the book is entitled The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. And I appreciate the fact that you have an addendum there which talks about simple steps to a healthier brain, which relates to your newer book, The Aging Brain, because there are concrete steps we can do to make sure that our brain functions effectively. And lo and behold, many of those ideas are found in the pages of Scripture, aren't they?
And that's exactly beautiful. When you really understand modern science and understand Scripture, you will find there's always a perfect harmony between the two, because God, who is the Creator, is the sustainer of all the design laws, all the natural laws, all the laws of health, and coming back to understand Him and how He built things always leads us back to a healthier life.
Well, let's just, before we let you go, talk about what is available at your website. And, of course, we've already alluded to the fact that there's the Aging Brain material, but also some of your upcoming events. And we might even get you in studio sometime when you're going to be near us. But more importantly, all sorts of other very helpful ideas. So as people land at your website, comeandreason.com, for just a minute, Dr. Timothy Jennings, talk about what is available to our listeners if they would like to use some of those resources.
Right. There's a lot of free resources there, and I would tell them to check on the Media Center first. We have a whole lot of different DVD lecture series that are free for streaming. We also send DVDs across the United States of America at no cost if people don't have the streaming ability. But things like The Developing Brain, how transgenerational decisions from parents and grandparents passed down, intrauterine decisions during pregnancy, and then early childhood experiences affect the developing brain. We have lectures on the aging brain. We have drug-free treatments for depression, recovering from sexual abuse, and many other more resources are available there. We have blog material, weekly Bible study classes, audios, PowerPoint slides are available. So a lot of resources available. Most of the resources available are at no cost. And so we encourage people to use those and share those in their community.
Well, Dr. Timothy Jennings, let me just mention again that a number of individuals over the years that we've interviewed have endorsed your book. It's published by InterVarsity Press, about 250 pages, and it is entitled The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. But again, I just appreciate the fact that some of you are out there on the cutting edge, because I think one of the great challenges in this world right now, where you have these brain studies being written by secular scientists saying, well, there's no soul, there's really no independent choices. You think you're making choices, but really you've got this meat computer called a brain that's actually controlling you. And it's nice to recognize that you are actually pushing back against that, and not only disagreeing with that view, but saying you missed a very important point, because your view of God, your actual views and ideas are very important. And that's why the Apostle Paul told us to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So if anything, some of these brain studies are validating what we've read in Scripture over the millennia. So Dr. Timothy Jennings, I appreciate the work that you've done in writing this book, and I thank you for giving us a very important hour in the midst of, I know, is a very busy day for you. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some more issues, but this is a resource that I think you're going to find very helpful. We, again, have a link to the website, which is entitled comeandreason.com. The book is entitled The God-Shaped Brain, and maybe later we'll get into the whole issue of your aging brain as well. Take care of that brain that God has given you. Make sure that you have a bike helmet when you're riding a bicycle. Make sure that you're not doing things that are destroying brain cells, like drinking alcohol and a variety of other things that are not going to be helpful. It is a resource, a very important resource that God has given to you. Use it to the glory of God, and I hope that you'll take the time to find some of the material that we've talked about today, and certainly take the time to read the book, The God-Shaped Brain, How Changing Your View of God Transforms Your Life. Need to take a break. When we come back, we'll focus our time and attention on the creation evolution concept after these important messages.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've been around any length of time, you know that when we talk about the debate about origins, you have kind of this mindset that is explained by evolutionists that if people just knew a little bit more about science, they'd all be evolutionists, because we have all sorts of very good illustrations and examples in nature. So the only reason anybody would believe in creation or believe in intelligent design is because they were uneducated. But if nothing else, what we need to do is just educate young people more about the scientific endeavor. And then all of these fanciful fairy tales about intelligent design would fade away. And there's a new survey that's come out, interestingly enough, in bioscience that shows that America's views on evolution are significantly influenced by their knowledge about the theory. In other words, the only people that reject evolution are uninformed. Well, is there another viewpoint? I think there is, and that's why we're going to be doing that this hour here on Point of View. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to be talking with our friend Dr. Jonathan Witt. He is a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute for Center for Science and Culture. You may be familiar with some of his books, some of which we've talked about on this program. For example, A Meaningful World: How the Arts and Sciences Reveal the Genius of Nature. Also a book that he co-authored with Bill Dembski entitled Intelligent Design Uncensored, as well as probably his most recent book, Heretic: One Scientist's Journey from Darwin to Design. And I might also mention one that he co-authored with Jay Richards. Jay Richards has been on the program with us many times. The Hobbit Party: The Vision of Freedom That Tolkien Got and the West Forgot. So there's just all sorts of things that we can talk about today. And Jonathan Witt, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thanks for having me, Kerby.
What about this survey here? First of all, the survey, I think, first of all, doesn't seem to correlate with other surveys, but there is kind of this mindset that we're all aware of, that if people just knew a little bit more about science, they would embrace evolution and reject all these other counter theories. What are your thoughts?
Well, this paper and the way that the scientists that put together the survey, it puts me in this dilemma that I often find I'm in with some of these dogmatic Darwinists. And it's I either have to conclude that the scientists are incompetent or willfully deceptive. I don't want to think either bad thing about another person, but they don't give me an option, because there's some really flagrant problems with the way they do the survey that I would think that a thoughtful, well-trained researcher and somebody trained in statistics and survey creating would know to avoid, and yet they didn't avoid it. So, but we have blind spots, humans do, and if you become dogmatically committed to the faith that is Darwinism, it can create some blind spots. So maybe it is unintentional. I look forward to kind of digging into some of the ways this survey purports to claim, look, we found evidence that as young people get more educated in evolution, they're almost sure to become more accepting of evolution. But there's problems from at least a couple of major fronts with the survey.
I think so. And again, we have that on our website, pointofview.net, under the title Acceptance of Evolution, your article. And of course, you can then follow the link back to the original bioscience paper yourself. And before we're through, I want to move past the survey to all the things that evolutionists think they know, that whether it's the Galapagos finches or whether it's the fact that our eye is backwards put together and rewired, or the fossil record, or whatever it might be, that indeed we all know that shows that evolution is the case. And again, we'll get into those in detail. But one of the things that near the end of the paper you talk about is what's best called the survey's big gap. Talk about that, because in terms of the methodology, for just a minute, there is a tendency for them to conflate what you call understanding evolution with acceptance of evolution. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, they actually tried to improve on some previous surveys, which were also simplistic when it came to, trying to get at a sense of where people stood on the ID, evolution, creationism debate landscape. But they still managed to leave some big gaps, and the slanted language created problems. So for instance, they give these different options, and they leave out what strikes me as a huge option. And I'll just word what should have been one of their multiple choice options. God made various plants and animal forms in a series of discrete creative bursts over many millions of years. God created human beings pretty much in their current form. Some microevolution and some mass extinctions occurred in the history of life, but there was no macroevolution giving rise to fundamentally new biological forms. So, some people, shorthand might call that old earth creationism. And I'm not here advocating for one view or another, but to have such a basic kind of prominent view in the creationism, intelligent design, evolution landscape left out, that's very suspicious. Either the people putting the survey together just really had not done their homework on this debate, the landscape of this debate, or they wanted to somehow skew the results and leave out one key option.
And again, I think that part of that is maybe ignorance. As you and I well know, and certainly some of your colleagues, whether it's Bill Dembski or Jay Richards or Stephen Meyer or all the rest, if they've done any kind of discussion, debate, or roundtable discussion, sometimes you look over and say, do you really just not know that? I mean, are you really just that unaware? And if you're in your own field, and I understand that certainly one of the requirements, especially on a university campus, is you know more and more about less and less, so eventually you know nothing about everything about nothing, as the old joke goes. You may not even know one step outside of your field. And it is amazing that there are still lots of people that don't even know that there are scientists with very good academic credentials that believe in intelligent design. So it is quite possible they may not even know there are other views. They may think that all of those views reside in just a handful of groups that they've read about once in the New York Times or the Washington Post. But when we come back from the break, what I'd love to do is get into some of those things which evolutionists say, well, we know for a fact that evolution is true because we have the backwards wiring of a vertebrate eye, or we know that evolution is true because we can see the beak sizes of the finches, or we know that evolution is true because we have the fossil record, or whatever it might be. And you spend some time in this talking about that. And then I'd love to also delve into a couple of other things, because you have this incredible story of an individual who was a Finnish bioengineer who moved from believing in Darwin to design. So we've got a lot to cover. But most important, I'd love to get your thoughts, because most likely you have some questions about intelligent design, the creation evolution controversy, whether these kinds of ideas can or should be taught in the schools. And maybe you've seen some of these surveys that always imply that if we're going to teach science, we obviously have to eliminate the possibility that anything came to this planet by anything other than chance and random evolutionary process. So we would love to give you a chance to join our conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. Jonathan Witt, Ph.D., Senior Fellow with the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. We'll come back and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It is hard to imagine how a coffee house in Laurel, Maryland would be controversial. After all, the Ragamuffins Coffee House is known for not only serving coffee, but also for serving up a special blend of community service and worship. Apparently, it is that last item that started all the controversy. The local church opened the doors to the coffee house and opened its arms to reach out to the homeless and needy families in the community. But a new city ordinance banned them from holding any services in the building. Apparently, offering coffee 6 days a week was fine, but offering an extra shot of God on Sunday was not. Christiana Holcomb, legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, joined me on the Point of View radio talk show to explain why they had to seek legal action. The city adopted new zoning codes with the express intention of stopping the church from operating in the city's downtown area. First, it banned nonprofit organizations, but then changed the law to make houses of worship restricted to second-class zoning. The current law forces churches and other Christian organizations to submit to an expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain special exemption. This is a process not imposed on other secular organizations. What happened to this church and its coffee house is hardly an exception. Churches, home Bible studies, and Christian schools have had local governments use zoning laws to restrict their activities and even shut them down. Fortunately, there are some encouraging signs. Various religious liberty groups such as ADF, First Liberty Institute, and the American Center for Law and Justice are taking these cases, and the Justice Department has announced a place of worship initiative that would enforce religious protections. This is good news for churches and Christian outreaches. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jonathan Witt with us today, and he is again with the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. What about this idea that only educated people believe in evolution and anybody else that does not, well, they just need to be better informed? Love to get your comments and thoughts, 1-800-351-1212. And should intelligent design or two model approaches be taught in the public schools? Love to get your thoughts. Again, 800-351-1212. Jonathan, one of the things we talk about sometimes is the Goldilocks story and the idea that everything is just right. And we use that sometimes when we've talked with Jay Richards and others about astronomy because we see so many parameters that are just right. But you use it in a little different way, in which you say that like a baby bear's porridge in the Goldilocks tale, it's just right to know that evolution is not a purely random process, but that natural selection plays a clever role. And then you go on to say it's just right to know that the vertebrate eye is wired backwards. It's just right to know that the beak size in the Galapagos Islands is just right. Talk about, first of all, the concept of just right, because that's the way evolution's being taught today, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was having a little fun there. You know, Goldilocks, the mama bears, I think, is too cold. Papa bears is too hot. And I was pushing back with this survey that says, oh, that when they learn more, they accept evolution. Well, there's some problems with the survey, but there's also problems with the way that kids are being taught evolution. They'll get an airbrushed view of evolution, so they'll get some data points that, taken in isolation, seem to confirm evolutionary theory, but they'll carefully airbrush out or remove the stuff that creates problems for evolutionary theory. So to give all of that would be to make the evolution education too hot in this analogy. We make it like Papa Bear. And so, for instance, with the backward wiring of the eye, they say, oh, look, a designer, a brilliant, ingenious, intelligent designer would never wire the vertebrate eye, which includes the human eye, backwards the way it is. That creates a tiny little blind spot that most of us, of course, aren't even aware we have a blind spot. It's so tiny and so functionally irrelevant. But there it is, and Richard Dawkins has said, okay, so maybe the blind spot isn't really practically a problem, but it's a fussy, it's an inelegant design. No tidy-minded engineer, that was his phrasing, would have used such a design. So, but evolution, which is a trial and error, survival of the fittest, random mutation, natural selection process, higgledy-piggledy, it might have stumbled into something like that and then got, trapped down that pathway and then just made the best of it. So it makes perfect sense on an evolutionary ground. And so Richard Dawkins seems to think that's the end of the story, but there is peer-reviewed, well-researched, well-regarded literature within the subdiscipline of, eye biology, where they've dispensed with that notion. They give very good reasons why the so-called backward wiring is the best engineering solution for the vertebrate eye. The vertebrate eye is outstanding in certain ways. Part of being outstanding is it burns a lot of oxygen in those light-sensitive cells, and wiring it in, quote-unquote, backwards dramatically improves oxygen supply. So an engineer would say, oh, this is a constrained optimization situation. You can't have, I can have the most compact and light notebook computer, or I can have a computer with the biggest screen, but I can't have both. There has to be trade-offs in engineering. And here there was a trade-off, and the negative was this very tiny blind spot that has no functional disadvantage, and in return you get this huge payoff with improved oxygen flow. So from an engineering perspective, it's a brilliant solution to a problem. It's not at all some higgledy-piggledy, half-baked, poor design. It's very well designed. That Richard Dawkins either doesn't know about this or he willfully ignores it. That should give us pause. I mean, and he's not the only one. Nathan Lentz has had a book come out recently where he goes through and talks about all these bad designs in nature, and he lists the backward wiring of the eye, even though this notion has been debunked decades ago.
Well, and again, it relates to the broader issue, which our listeners would be aware of. You can hardly pick up a high school textbook these days in biology that doesn't talk about, well, we know that we have all sorts of vestigial organs, the tailbone, the coccyx, or the appendix, and all sorts of other things. And all of those are from previous generations were always put forward as, again, an obvious situation in which evolution was just trying to make it work, and so it ended up with sort of this Rube Goldberg kind of human body. And so you people that believe that God made us and created us and we are fearfully and wonderfully made, Psalm 139, well, that's ridiculous, because now we have all these vestigial organs, or as you just illustrated, a backward wire eye. But when other people look at it with a little bit more open mind, they're going, no, that's not the case. As if anything, we're recognizing the tremendous engineering sophistication of the human body, don't you think?
Right. Yeah. Like for instance, the appendix that gets cited as some weird vestigial organ that the Darwinian process burped up. But no pun intended. But we now know that the appendix, and this has been known for generations, that it does serve a valuable function. It holds good bacteria, so that if you ever, say, get dysentery or something, and you lose all your good bacteria in your stomach, there's a reserve there in your appendix. I'm a little sad to hear that, because I had my appendix removed when I was a kid. It was perfectly healthy appendix, but while they were down there, they just for some unrelated issue, surgery, they decided to grab it because they'd been taught that the appendix was useless. So yeah, if you approach the human body as, it's just a Darwinian happenstance, then you're likely to fall into those errors. Whereas if you approach the human body and say it looks amazingly designed. There's things in here that go far beyond anything a human could design, the eye, the ears, the brain. So maybe I should come at it with a respect and with the idea that maybe if I don't immediately understand what something's doing, maybe it'll surprise me. That's a more fruitful perspective. It's the intelligent design perspective.
Yeah, and we hear about so-called junk DNA, and we find out it's not junk, and it's not flotsam and jetsam left over, and all those kinds of things. Let me take one more that you mentioned, and that is the Galapagos finches. Some people call them the Darwin's finches, but Darwin really wasn't looking at them as much as he was looking at the tortoises. But nevertheless, the argument that has come is, well, we see the changes in the beak size, so that proves evolution. And of course, there was an individual that won a Pulitzer Prize for that particular work. But again, I don't think you can find a textbook where you don't pop it open, a high school textbook that has some evidence that the Darwin's finches or the Galapagos finches illustrate evolution. But they really don't emphasize that or illustrate that at all, do they?
Yeah, it's very limited. At best, they demonstrate microevolution, that is, small changes within a species. The beak size gets a little bigger in certain conditions, maybe a drought. Then it gets a little smaller when those change. There's never any evidence that the beak sizes continue to evolve and eventually lead to some different species. They're often talking about, here's a different new species of Galapagos finch. Well, recently they discovered that these a couple of these separate species were interbreeding. Well, most people, when you've got two birds or two animals and they can interbreed and give healthy offspring, you think of that as the same species, maybe different breeds of the same species, but the same species. So, and that's, by the way, another way that they try to stack the deck, the evolutionists. They'll split what really a reasonable person would regard as members of the same species into multiple species to make it look like, evolution is doing such dramatic things, creating new species. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors there. They're expanding well beyond what the Galapagos finch story there's really evidence for, and claiming it for the big Darwinian story of evolution from of all things from an original single-celled organism.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's take some phone calls. I might just mention that this is about 5 pages long, and it deals with the whole idea of acceptance of evolution. Of course, he takes on the survey that we just talked about a minute ago, and we've only picked out 2 of the paragraphs on what's called the evolution porridge. Not too hot, not too cold, just right, and how that is taught, and then even the way in which some of this is taught. And so if you're really concerned about what is being taught on the subject of origins in the public school system, or you're concerned about those who would argue that if you're really intelligent, you're really going to believe in evolution, this, I think, is just one resource out of many that we have made available on our website, pointofview.net. And when we come back, we'll also talk about some of the other resources which are available at the Discovery Institute, and that's discovery.org. And in particular, we'll also talk about this new book coming out about heretic, what that means. A lot to cover, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the subject of intelligent design, but also what's going on in the schools today. Interestingly enough, such a battle against even presenting and providing another alternative. You have evidence against evolution in many peer-reviewed biology texts, literature, in various astronomy and chemistry journals, all sorts of places, and yet, again, just a little knowledge is allowed, and so much of it is sort of airbrushed out, and that's one of the things that we're talking about with Dr. Jonathan Witt. And it isn't just in the schools, it's also in the academy, and I thought we'd, for just a minute, talk about your new book, which you have co-authored with Maddie, who actually was, as I understand, a Finnish scientist who actually had a student provide a book that was criticizing evolutionary theory, and Maddie reacted angrily and set out to defend evolution, but instead found that he had more questions than answers. So it's not just that the high school and college students aren't getting the picture. Even individuals that are in these fields sometimes don't know that there's contrary evidence. But tell us a little bit more what's in this new book.
Yeah, it's titled Heretic, One Scientist's Journey from Darwin to Design. It was a delight to write it with Matti. He, as you said, a Finnish scientist. He spent some of his career in academia at some very well-respected universities, both there in his native country of Finland, but also in Switzerland. And he, as you said, he started out as a, dyed-in-the-wool Darwinist, but then he, got challenged by a student. Initially, he was like, that's ridiculous, that's stupid. Then he heard the Christian apologist Francis Schaeffer. Some of you may be familiar with him, Chris. Yes. I'm sure you are. And he pointed out that a couple of things. One, this idea of this fact-value split in modern thinking, where religion and morals and the things we value, that's in this upper story. But then all the facts, the hard data, that's in the lower story, and that's where scientists should be focused. That's where all real research should be being done. And Francis Schaeffer challenged that and exploded that, and that got Matti to thinking. And he also, another thing Francis Schaeffer pointed out is, if somebody is really confident in their view, they won't typically, they may be wrong, but if they're truly confident, they're not going to get touchy and angry when you challenge it. And Matti Leisala had to think, I was quite touchy when I was challenged. So I don't sound like somebody that's that confident. That further prodded him to start investigating. And so then he had this, really rich background in science, biology, particularly proteins and specifically enzymes. And so he was very well equipped to dig into the science once he was motivated to. And he found that many of these things he'd been told about evolutionary theory didn't wash, that there were, major problems with the theory, and that he had only been excluding design because of a dogmatic commitment to a materialistic, non-God, non-design perspective. So that started a journey for him, and he came out the other side a committed, pro-design, anti-Darwinist. And the amazing thing is that he had a very successful career, even in highly secularized, highly pro-Darwin, pro-evolution Europe. Though he had some serious run-ins, and we talk about some of those in the book. So there's some exciting storytelling along with us giving a very reader-friendly explanation of the science of why Darwinism fails and why intelligent design is the better option.
I might just mention that you can go to discovery.org/store and find Heretic there. And you might say, I have this friend and he's just convinced that anybody that has a brain is going to believe in evolution, and that you, if you don't believe in evolution, are kind of stupid. So this might be helpful because you might say, look, I don't know a thing about biochemistry. I don't know a thing about bioengineering. I took as few science classes as possible, but I'd still like to kind of witness to my science friend here who's skeptical about God and skeptical about intelligent design. That's at least a book I would think, Jonathan, that somebody could hand to their friend and say, I found this kind of interesting, and here's an individual who is working in this area of bioengineering, and he began to see these micro machines and all of the sophistication and design, and that certainly doesn't look like something that came about by random chance. And so that might be a very helpful book in terms of maybe starting a conversation about intelligent design and ultimately the designer, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. That's kind of how we designed the book. His credentials as a scientist are unimpeachable. He's very successful, like I said, both in the private industry. He worked for a major biotech firm, but also very successful as a university professor. Many dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed research articles in biology. He's got his groups led to some patents in biotechnology. So amazing guy. And yet we were able to come together and make the book so that it's very accessible, and so it's a great resource. Heretic, and he's a heretic in the sense that he broke from Darwinism.
Right.
He's actually a faithful Christian as far as religion goes. He's not a religious heretic.
Yeah.
He's a Darwin heretic.
He's a Darwin heretic. And it relates a little bit to Michael Behe, who you mentioned in your article here, because Michael Behe wrote Darwin's Black Box. And the illustration, I think, is good because back in the 19th century, we only had light microscopes. So in some respects, the cell was like a black box. Darwin couldn't really understand what was in the cell. But now with electron microscopes, whether it's Michael Behe or whether it's Matty Lasola or any of these individuals, they are able to find that we have these incredibly efficient micro machines at the cellular level. And as Michael Behe points out, they all require all the parts to come together immediately, what's called irreducible complexity. And that's a really powerful argument because even as Paul Nelson was on the program a while back said, if you could have shown Charles Darwin back then these kinds of things, and does this look like this is part of your evolutionary platform and pattern and pathway you're talking about, or is this maybe look more designed? I think we now know a lot more in the 21st century than Charles Darwin knew about science in the 19th century.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those kind of interesting alternative reality. If he had been able to be put in a time machine, brought forward, shown how amazingly sophisticated even a single-celled bacteria, which is about as simple as you can get and still be a living organism, how amazingly sophisticated those are. I mean, one scientist, Michael Denton, referred to a single-celled bacteria as a micro-miniaturized factory. It has thousands of intricate parts, and it's without parallel in the world of human engineering. It's unbelievably sophisticated. And he's talking about the kind of bacteria you would need as the first living organism before you even got the Darwinian process of random mutation and natural selection. At some point, all the chemicals in Darwin's warm little pond would have had to come together. Darwin probably imagined that the first single-celled organism was something quite simple. We now know that it's more sophisticated than any human factory we've ever made and may ever make. So that should give any reasonable person pause. It doesn't give some people pause because I would argue that they're not reasonable. They're irrationally committed to a worldview that, as Howard Lewontin, Harvard geneticist said, we cannot let a divine foot in the door. That's our dogma. He was very frank about it in an article in the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, I love that quote. I mean, here's a prominent evolutionist, one that I studied when I was in graduate school at Yale, who says we cannot allow a divine foot inside the door. So just a great illustration of that. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, I might, since we were talking about Michael Behe, you also quote from him in terms of what we now know in terms of natural selection. And again, as I've said before, let's give Charles Darwin his due. He recognized that natural selection could happen just as we've had artificial selection, but he didn't know much about how evolutionary change would take place. And so once we learned more about genetics, we said, oh, okay, mutation along with natural selection gives us evolution. But I want to come back because one of the things you quote there are some research done by people like Michael Behe and others that are saying there seem to be some limits to what mutation can actually do, very severe limits, and that itself begins to also raise some very significant challenges to the evolutionary theory. So again, we've posted some great material here today. We have a link, of course, to discovery.org. And I just mentioned a minute ago this new book out called Heretic. And then, of course, we also have the article about this idea of evolution and how, in some respects, surveys that have come out say, well, really, if people understood evolution and they really had any kind of scientific sophistication, they would believe in evolution. Jonathan Witt saying, actually, if you look at some of the peer-reviewed research, it has some really significant questions about the theory of evolution. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The long wait to see what kind of a judge President Trump would appoint to the nation's highest court is now over. Just ahead looms the confirmation battle for Judge Neil Gorsuch. His qualifications for the office are unquestionable. With degrees from Columbia, Harvard, and Oxford, there can be little doubt about his intelligence. But what about his record as a judge? Well, at First Liberty Institute, we have one criterion for evaluating judicial candidates. Does his record reflect a history of upholding the Constitution, especially as to religious liberty? Well, I'm happy to say that it does. Judge Gorsuch wrote and joined opinions supporting the rights of ministries like Little Sisters of the Poor and closely held family businesses like Hobby Lobby to be free from the burden imposed by the HHS abortion pill mandate. He wrote or signed opinions upholding the constitutionality of the public display of Ten Commandments monuments, and even wrote an opinion defending the existence of cross-shaped memorials for fallen state troopers. Whether Neil Gorsuch will adequately fill the shoes of the late Justice Scalia is impossible to fully predict. What we can say with some confidence is that Judge Gorsuch has a history of defending the First Amendment from the bench. We hope that Justice Gorsuch will live up to the American people's expectation and strongly protect our constitutional freedoms. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Dr. Jonathan Witt, again with the Discovery Institute, and we have a link to discovery.org. You might want to get the new book, Heretic. Of course, we've posted this particular article, and there are some other resources I want to talk about in just a minute. But since we mentioned Michael Behe, you actually quote the fact that there are studies that Michael Behe has done at the molecular level. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Ray Boland, wrote a book years ago called Natural Limits to Biological Change. And we, whether you look at the macro level or the micro level, recognize that there seem to be real limits on any kind of mechanism that would give you evolutionary change. And that's at the very fundamental level of what the evolutionary theory would teach, correct? Guess we've lost Jonathan Witt, so I guess we'll have to continue on with
here I am.
Oh,
sorry.
Gotcha.
I'm here.
Okay,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Kerby. Yeah, Michael Behe, this book, The Edge of Evolution, he went and he took and kind of pulled together research from looking at the E. coli bacteria, looking at the AIDS virus, looking at the malaria disease, and he did a very rigorous statistical analysis showing that there are severe limits to how far these mutations can go. And some people say, well, evolution takes millions of years to show up. It's a very slow process. So, you've heard people say, why don't we see monkeys turning into humans now, which is kind of a silly argument against evolution, actually, because it is such a slow process. But mammals, they have a 10, 20 year generation turnover, whereas these microbes, you have these huge populations of them just in a petri dish, and they'll have these extremely rapid turnover rates. So you can get millions and billions of samples of mutations, and so you can work statistics, and then you can extrapolate and say, okay, what could evolution do if we were looking at the many millions or hundreds of millions of years that is proposed by evolutionary theory, and so he crunches the numbers and shows that you could get maybe some very small stuff. Evolution tends to be good at the micro level at breaking things, and sometimes when it breaks something, it creates a niche advantage. You see that a lot in malaria and in antibiotic resistance, but you don't see fundamentally new species of bacteria or fundamentally new machinery in, say, the malaria virus. You just don't see that. And so that's the kind of thing you won't get taught in a typical high school class in biology. You'll just get taught, oh, look, bacteria can develop antibiotic resistance. So they'll tell you that, but they won't tell you the rest of the story. So that's another example of that Goldilocks type of education, where they don't want it to get too hot. They don't want to give you too much information. They just want, to use another metaphor, they just want to airbrush the evidence for evolution to make it look good, even though there are some serious warts and serious problems with it.
And again, if I can paraphrase Jonathan Wells, who, of course, Dr. Jonathan Wells used to say, you look at all the things we've done for the fruit flies, and we've irradiated them and everything, and either you get a defective fruit fly or a dead fruit fly, but you don't get a horse fly, much less a horse. I mean, again, I'm using a paraphrase, but the point he's making is that there's just these natural limits here. And if we want to be fair to the next generation of scientists who are taking classes and required to take classes in biology, both in middle school and in high school, not to mention those who maybe are majoring in biology in college, when we don't tell them the rest of that story, and they want to have, as you said, that just right, not too hot, not too cold, just enough. Or to use a different metaphor that you use as well, when we want to airbrush out any of the contrary pieces of evidence, then they come out being just as dogmatic as your co-author in the book Heretic, because they're convinced that there is no evidence for anything other than a belief in random mutations, natural selection, and evolution over billions of years. But if you start looking at the peer-reviewed data, you get a different story, don't you?
You do, and you mentioned Ray Bolin. Ray and I drove to Austin. We both live in the Dallas area. We drove to Austin to testify before the state school board when they were reviewing all the standards, including the biology standards. This is a couple of years ago. They had been tasked to streamline all the state standards because some people argued, and maybe justifiably, that they were so convoluted. It was hard for a lot of the teachers to cover everything. Well, the Darwinists took this opportunity to say, let's streamline out some of the hard-won lines in those standards that said, you know what, you need to teach not just the strengths or the airbrush, positive, Goldilocks, as I've put it, version of evolutionary theory. You also need to expose kids to some of the evidential weaknesses, some of the critical problems with evolution. You don't have to teach intelligent design. You don't have to, invoke creationism, but you do have to, for instance, expose students to the fact that there is peer-reviewed literature showing how limited the ability of bacteria is to mutate and change. You have to tell students about the fact that there's a pattern in the fossil record where new forms appear abruptly in the fossil record, as if they just came out of nowhere. Evolutionists fought tooth and nail to get those standards removed. And you have to ask, why would you want, if you've got such a powerful theory that you argue it's a fact, that no reasonable person could doubt it, why wouldn't you want to tell students about the pattern of abrupt appearance and then give the easy explanation for that within an evolutionary framework? It makes no sense. It only makes sense if it's a dogma and they know there are serious weaknesses and they don't want young people to know about them because it may raise legitimate doubts in their minds.
And I might just mention again in your article that we've made available here, you do talk about how Darwinists tried to remove some of that from the state biology standards. Of course, we also have some sections there about everything from the argument that the vertebrate eye is backwardly wired, the limits to an evolutionary change, the fossil record, and much, much more. So there's just some great resources. And again, if you find yourself saying, I'd like to maybe hand a book to somebody that is interested in this area, but maybe would hear and maybe read about a story of somebody that actually was a hardcore Darwinist, but eventually came to a belief in design, what kind of book could that possibly be? And that's this book, Heretic, which has just come out. Of course, I might just recommend some of the others, because if you know somebody that's been in the arts, this book that came out a number of years ago, A Meaningful World, How the Arts and Sciences Reveal the Genius of Nature, that would be another book. So just some great resources. And again, these have been books that have been written by or co-written by Jonathan Witt. And I appreciate you taking the time to join us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. You're an excellent host. Very knowledgeable. Thanks.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to spend some time getting back into the news. We have some hints about who it is possible President Donald Trump might select as his Supreme Court nominee. We have some reaction to some of that, which we'll get into. We'll also have Dr. Barry Creamer in studio. We're going to talk a little bit more about Christian higher education and how to develop a Christian worldview. And if you've been interested at all in sports, and I've certainly been paying attention to the World Cup, and it has been interesting over in Russia. That has been an opportunity for individuals to share the gospel and to pass out gospel tracts. So we're going to be talking with an individual who has been doing that in Russia. So we've got lots to cover, and that will all be taking place tomorrow. Let me encourage you, though, if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the material we've talked about today, the God-shaped brain, a conversation we had an hour ago, the information that we've posted today by Jonathan Witt, that's available on the website. And so take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net. And also, if you would click on that button that says donate, we would greatly appreciate that help as well. I want to thank We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers, defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the